Thank you for joining us, Edmund. I've got a few things. I think we'll get on to Ofsted and what's happened there in the past, and we'll get on to how Ofsted can change in the future. But I'm intrigued by something you said last night, is that this is your second podcast of the morning, and your first podcast was an Australian Doctor Who one. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's my other hat. So in my professional career, I'm a toy designer. I'm principally, the thing that I've worked on for the last 20 years is the Doctor Who action figure line for character options. I mean, I've done a lot else in my career, and I have other clients that I work for at the same time as doing that, but that's the one that sort of gets the most notice. So yeah, 30 years making toys. I'm a sculptor, so mostly anything that's figurative. I've done action figures, game pieces, bubble bath bottles, collectible things, all sorts of things.
Out of interest, as a toy designer, how do you see some of the EdTech products that schools are purchasing and using, or do you not have much sight of that sort of thing?
It really made me laugh, actually, going back to the previous administration. I remember the big push that they were talking about getting a 3D printer in every school, and that was a vital thing. And it was and 3D printers are just a tool. What you want to be teaching is, the solid basis of design and what to do with that tool. So I have been to plenty of schools where I've seen their shiny 3D printer on display, but having, achieved nothing other than a few test parts they've downloaded from the internet. And I'd really love to see that side of
You're
things.
talking literally about a golden thread that's come up this morning, Alan, that it's not the shiny stuff that's worth it, it's everything else, isn't it? It's the basics behind it. You're best known to me, Edmund, certainly, as a voice of reason for Ofsted, following, I don't think tragic quite covers it really, does it? The death of Ruth Perry and getting the Caversham primary inspection. And I read your threads, and I read them ever since you started doing them. And I mean, what's your current thoughts on, if you were to summarise Ofsted as an entity at the moment and what they're proposing as changes, if you were to summarise it in one word, what would it be?
You see, summarising anything in one word's a big mistake, and I couldn't do it. I think we are definitely at a nexus point for change. I don't think if this consultation for the revised framework and the report card system is a true and honest representation of feedback, and they really start doing something, I think we're going to be going into a fairly dark place, because I'm pretty sure that the profession's not going to take much more of this. We can't have any more furious tinkering around the edges whilst essentially it's the same, old banger underneath. It doesn't matter what
exactly what seems to be
and
happening.
Can we take the conversation just to follow that thread, Edmund? I'm kind of interested because I'm conscious we'll be selective with our language, but the adage of you can't polish a turd springs to mind sometimes when we're talking about what is very much a tinkering around the edges. And for certainly the last 30, 40 years, when it comes to explicitly the education space, nobody's wanted to implement change that doesn't have a start and finish point within an electoral cycle. It's a credit-based system, and so we end up taking out small strands and trying to tweak to give the optics that there's significant change. That's kind of how the Ofsted process feels to me right now. But I've mentioned on a couple of the episodes, I spent last year researching for a book, and the first chapter is all about what is a good school. And I think sometimes we flip the conversation around to, well, what should we be measuring? What's actually the thing we hold most dear? And often, if I stopped you in a lift and said, Tell me about your school and what makes it amazing. The things you mentioned, probably not many of them would be the things that are on the inspection framework. So I'm interested in, given your concerns about it, not just the process, but the breadth of it, where do you see the priorities of what we should be reflecting on and measuring in our schools?
Well, essentially, I think the big problem that we have at the moment is that regardless of what Ofsted are trying to, at the moment, go through a sort of, I don't know, metamorphosis and come out of their chrysalis with the shiny new head of Martin Oliver saying everything's changed and we're a butterfly now. But the problem is that at the core of inspection is the concept that Ofsted have to be able to go into a school and make difficult assessments, which they interpret as they have to have the ability to upset people. And they can try and dress this up any way they like, but inherent to that concept of going in and having to be able to upset people are a series of dangers. So that's to do with the actual inspection itself. And then, of course, you've got the wider context of consequences of inspection. So you get this, basically, how an inspection's conducted, how it makes people feel on the day, what the judgments are made, and how much fidelity there is to real life. So how a setting can respond to those judgments, and the breadth of challenge that they're able to make against those judgments, and then the consequences of those judgments. At the moment, we are failing on all three of those elements. So inspections being inconsistent and inspector behaviour, conduct being questionable at times, then judgments being made on a very narrow evidence base and, as they say, a snapshot in time that might not reflect the true work context of the school that they're visiting, and then finally at times disproportionate set of consequences. Now, some things have happened to change some things, and there are some things that are coming up that I totally welcome. The concept of trying to get more organisational structure within Ofsted so that there is a consistent training programme, their so-called academy, where all of the inspectors are going to supposedly receive the same instruction so that they're all working off the same basis, whereas in the previous system, because of the regional system, there can be a vast difference between different regions. That's great. Transparency in terms of exactly what they're assessing, so that everybody knows what they're assessing, so that they know what the benchmarks are. That's a great thing. But fundamentally, it's still the same thing. You know, when you look at, we had 4 judgments, single word judgments that, or two word phrase that are supposed to describe the whole school. Well, we've added an extra one. We've got 5 now, and we're splitting it into 8 different headings. But essentially, it's a traffic light system, and you can look at many research studies that have been done about traffic light systems and their efficacy to changing standards. And you always come back to that analogy that if you were in your workplace, who would stand for all of their performance reviews being made public to everyone in the company? Where there's some giant notice board where you can go and see everyone in the company and how they're working. And the reason companies don't do that is because it doesn't produce good results. Happy people produce good results.
Yeah.
So without wanting to be a ridiculous hippie about the whole thing, there just needs to be a more holistic and sharing attitude to the concept of school accountability. We just need more peer-to-peer support. You know, you need to be able to be put in touch with people who've been through your situation, because you know, that's the other thing. We're talking about schools, we're talking about settings that are in a vast array of socio-economic differences in terms of climate, and you know, where the school in the heart of the country is not going to have the same issues as the school in the city. And yeah, again, slight tweaks around the edges so that these contexts are being reflected in how inspection is taking place, but fundamentally it looks pretty much like it's the same criteria. And what it all comes back to, if I could condense it into a single word, it would be judgment. And that's the thing, and that's still very, very present in Ofsted's language. It's the idea of judging and being judgmental.
Just two things. I mean, Al and I and other guests have had conversations here, and you've touched upon things we've talked about, in that it doesn't. Why can't it be that you have a colleague from another school in your area who understands your context working alongside you with a representative from the local authority or Ofsted or a new body, would be my preference. And it's a termly supportive meeting, and if you have to have a formal inspection every 3 to 5 years, then so be it. But what is this obsession with having to judge it? Why can't it just be a holistic report? Why does it need summarising in 1 word, 4 words, 5 words? What is the point of it? Because like you say, you just wouldn't do it anywhere else. Why do we put up with it?
My little sort of nitpicks, but it's important. It's like presentation is important. We know presentation is important from having to communicate to other people. And when you look at the revised scorecard system, the sort of immediate impression that you get, we read in English right to left, and it starts red and goes to green. So whatever the first piece of information you come across will always be the worst, inverted commas, thing that Ofsted has to say about that school. So it's just even that, and you know, there's all of these, again, psychology comes into it, and it's one of those things where you just look at the system, and I cannot believe. So one of the clearest recommendations that's been made through my interactions with Ofsted, and you know, I spent 19 hours with the Conservative administration in meetings with Gillian Keegan, the DFE, with Martin Oliver, when he came in, and attended all of the accountability hearings, and went to the select committee and all of that stuff. And that process, going through all of that, has really taught me that for change to really happen, there needs to be independent accountability at Ofsted. Accountability is a big word with Ofsted, but what they don't have is an independent oversight over complaints, over challenge. And again, Sir Martin Oliver's recent performance at his accountability hearing at the Select Committee seemed to imply that this was impossible. And I think that's a logical fallacy. I think that you look at any other inspectorate or any other regulator, they all have a means of redress for people that are subject to their judgments. They all have a challenge process that is independently scrutinised. If I have an issue with medical health, with the way the police behave, any of those, there is an independent body that I can go to that will look at my case and adjudicate. And without that pressure release from the system, and that's what I'm constantly looking for, is how is the pressure relieved from the system, then I don't see reform as being meaningful. Because you have to, if you're subject to that system, it's like policing by consent. If we're subject to the system, we have to have the confidence that if there is a problem, we can go to someone and have it independently assessed, and not have, as we still have the case now, Ofsted marking its own homework.
Just following on that theme, Edmund, it's really interesting and very much resonates what you're sharing. Last year, I had 3 different Ofsted inspections and probably had the full gamut in terms of inspection teams and the way that they chose to engage with our staff, and seeing the varying stress levels from leadership across the different schools based purely, frankly, I think, on their approach, whether they chose to leave the sword of Damocles hanging on the first night and a ridiculously long list of requests, whether it was combative or whether it was actually consultative, where actually there's way more value to be had from that process. But there's always this conversation. There's one about the way in which you do an inspection and making sure that that's professional and fair and consistent. There's a second cap, which actually, are we looking at the right things when we're measuring the suitability and value of what our schools are doing? But the third thing is always the way you make it less combative, less confrontational, the way that you make it less specific in terms of very focused grades. There will always be a counter argument, and I'm playing devil's advocate, that as a parent or as a counsellor, my ability to judge if it's the right school for me or the school is performing becomes more and more woolly. In the same way as we might say, well, if we don't want all these inspections in hospitals, I don't know whether I trust that casualty department. Now, I think there's another logical fallacy in there, which is if you do something in a more collaborative way, somehow you're always going to get a less valid result, when actually we see collaboration being the opposite. But how do you mitigate that tension that will naturally come up?
Well, I think obviously we have to have standards, and it's one of those things where, to a certain degree, it's where I kind of I appreciate the danger of becoming a naysayer who just says whatever, and it's not. I think it's that over the course of the last 2 years, the place where I place my faith in terms of the future of accountability is in the education professionals that I encounter, the people that are part of the system and use the system. And it's those people's voices which are the ones that need to be heard. I mean, since the stopped working within the Tory context of, if you like, our work was to try and go in and persuade Gillian Keegan that it was a good idea to reform Ofsted, when fundamentally what Ofsted's work entirely was in line with their political goals, both in terms of how accountability is presented, how it provided them data to show school improvement, inverted commas, and also to drive the academisation philosophy that they had. I've been casting the net wider to the wider community. So both Julia Waters, Ruth Perry's sister, who I still work with and speak to on practically a daily basis, we cast a net further, talked with the unions, and Julia ran a very good round table at the Labour Party conference with the heads of all the unions in a very, unprecedented event of all of them getting together in talking in unison, because of course the different members of all the education unions cannot indeed at sometimes be at loggerheads with each other. There are differing interests between head teachers and line regular line teachers, so they to get that level of accord, I think really shows where we could be, because those people were more than happy to get together to discuss this problem that we have and how they would like to see it. So they wanted to do something that was positive, and they wanted to say what they would like to see from accountability. And the same things keep coming up again and again, which is the peer review. Now, where you are in terms of representing school achievement to the parents, I think you that's another question. And I've been involved in a PhD study on school accountability, which I am dying to know the results of, because I'm not running it, but I've simply been taking part in, again, conversations between different people with different views on accountability. And so often when in those sessions, again, it's the things that schools have. I think most parents assume a basic level of education that their kids are going to get. And really what people look for when they go into a school is almost everything else. So they assume that standards are going to be to a certain level, and they will go and they'll look and see how thriving the music department is, or the art department, or how what kind of extracurricular activities there are there, and how engaged students seem to be on a school visit. I mean, I don't think I've ever made a decision about sending any of my children to a school that didn't depend most strongly on a school visit to see how that school operates.
I think you've hit on something quite important there, Edmund, is that certainly the Conservative government, their argument for Ofsted and the accountability framework, as was and as is that parents use Ofsted to make a judgment on where their schools will go. I don't know anybody that's come here based on the Ofsted report. I don't know any parents that have chosen a secondary school based on the Ofsted report. Ofsted purely to me is a stick to beat schools with, I'm afraid. But my bigger issue is and there's nothing bigger than what's happened really in terms of tragedies, but is that Al and I share some thoughts on innovation in schools and how the education system needs to change. It's the accountability framework that is stifling that.
Yeah.
So it's a huge issue in terms of holding us back as a system. Never mind holding us accountable. It's a massive barrier.
I've always had a very, I suppose, ridiculously reductive opinion of the whole system, which is that we shouldn't look within any system at the sort of the best or the average results, because yes, I'll have had plenty of people going to me on Twitter, I had a fantastic Ofsted inspection. It was really collegiate. They were really good. It came in. I'm really proud of what our school's achieved. I'm going to put my Ofsted grade on a banner on the outside and thing. And it's like, that's great. I fully concede that, that is many, many schools, many head teachers' experience. But you have to look to the other end and say, if the other end is that a teacher dies as a consequence of their inspection, is it acceptable? Is that an acceptable system? Is there any degree of that which is acceptable? And I'll tell you, over the last 2 years, there is hardly a week that goes by without a head teacher contacting me, who comes at this from the position of being merely a parent who happened to love the school, be very I wasn't even involved. I've never been a massive PTA parent. I'm simply a parent of 4 kids who I knew went to an excellent school and had a brilliant head teacher. And what happened to her is just offends me so much that it sent me on this journey that I cannot not do something about it if I have any power at all to do something about it. Yeah, I think that we have there's so many layers of horrible irony, often the language of Ofsted, in terms of when you look at, for example, what they say looking about safeguarding and stuff, is stuff that they are, as an institution, more than guilty of.
I think, yeah.
We will look down on people that have closed to criticism and not willing to learn from the mistakes of their past.
Pot calling the kettle black, isn't it, really?
Christine Gilbert's report, which Ofsted commissioned, and they tried to bury in the Big Listen as an annex to the Big Listen, like paper number 5 or whatever it was. Oh yeah, we had this done. That said in great detail how organisationally dysfunctional it was, how it had a board that didn't have proper oversight over decisions made, how the board wasn't briefed on Ruth Perry's death until it had become national news. They didn't know about it, that they didn't institute any serious review, that there is no managerial structure in terms of performance reviews, that there were inspectors who, when interviewed by Christine Gilbert, said they had never had a performance review.
Edmund, can I just interrupt, sorry? You know this inside out, really, but when you refer to that board, is that board still in place as a whole?
Well, funnily enough, the chair is just retired, so I don't think they filled the position yet. So if there's anyone out there and who feels that they could give proper oversight, because Sir Martin is now committed to listening to the board. It was one of his big listen commitments following the Gilbert review was to submit to the will, because the big that Gilbert said about that board was that there is nothing within the articles that govern Ofsted's work that compels the chief inspector to actually listen to or comply with the board's rulings. And in fact, Sir Martin said something very similar to the select committee in his accountability hearing, where he said the only people that he was accountable to were the select committee themselves. I get very frustrated at this because I heard in that select committee some brilliant questions asked, but they didn't come back on the answers. And the only reason I can think that they didn't come back on the answers is that they weren't sufficiently briefed. Because I'm sitting there watching it, Julia and I are watching it at the same time, and almost every question that you go, well, hang on a minute, you can't say, for example, the most egregious thing he said was that there was no suggestion that anything had been done wrong at Caversham whatsoever. And you go, we had an entire inquest.
Clearly shown that there was, and a lack of training for Ofsted inspectors.
Those things are really damaging. Of course, there was nobody came back from the select committee because
the words Ofsted and safeguarding are a complete conflict to me, because Ofsted is the biggest safing issue for school staff because of the stress and the worry it causes and the impact it's had on so many people. But also, these people come back and say, well, Ofsted needs to check school safeguarding policies and procedures and how well they do it. Well, if it was that important, it wouldn't be done every 5 years or up to 10 or 12 years. Somebody more local should be checking safeguarding. because it actually is a hugely important thing. It shouldn't be anything part of Ofsted's remit whatsoever.
On a positive news, just following on the comments you just shared there, Edmund, the new role for the chair of the Office for Standards in Education Services and Skills is currently advertised, and it closes its advertisement on the 25th of February, and it's a 2-day-a-week role. Hopefully there's somebody, a brave person, who's willing to get involved and shape. But
Do you think I'd stand a chance? Do you think I'd stand a chance?
Go for it.
I'd love to think so, but we're always very mindful, aren't we, that perhaps they're looking for a different kind of person. Who knows?
Yeah,
we can be cynical. I mean, I think everybody, and there's an irony in the big listen that there's been a process to get feedback. You bump into anybody within the education space, and you hear the same points, the same challenges being resonated, and yet when it's distilled down into the summary of all those views, they all seem to largely be diminished down to well, we already had a plan in advance and we're just going to carry on down that journey. So co-production only works if you actually listen to the output and actually let it shape the direction of travel.
The big list of questions were a joke. It was.
Yeah, I know, but it was, again, it's political optics, but
Yeah.
It does more harm than good, because if you pretend you're listening, people see through it. Certainly in education, where, as we've flip-flopped in the conversation here, number one priority for all of us in our schools is the safeguarding welfare of our staff and children. And the body overseeing it doesn't see the welfare and safeguarding as our staff as being that big a deal. Now, I'm sure they would say you're completely wrong. We absolutely do, Al. But they obviously haven't taken it seriously enough. Otherwise, we wouldn't find ourselves having these conversations. I'm really mindful. We've just run over the half-hour point. Edmund, could we kind of close the circle with, I've just handed you the magic wand for overseeing and inspecting our schools. Where would you like us to end up?
I think I would like to end up. I think that for me, really, the system has to be designed with experts, not just within education, but also within the field of well-being, mental health, and suicide prevention. And whatever system that you come up with has to be checked by these professionals as well. And whatever system that we do come up with, and there's any number of possibilities. I'm not necessarily averse to inspection, but it depends on, again, what's being inspected, how it's being inspected, peer review, any number of different things. But whatever the end result, it has to be a result that has built-in pressure reliefs, so that we can ensure that nobody feels, as Ruth did, that whatever system you come up with, it is a system that people are confident in. The people that use it are confident that it's going to represent them, and are confident that if something goes wrong, their concerns will be listened to.
Thank you, Edmund. I don't want to diminish the seriousness, frankly, of this conversation and what's at the heart of it. But we started on your background and your experiences in a very different space. So I thought we might close a little bit of the conversation by saying, if you were asked to sculpt and model a character to represent the education system and that oversight, what would be the traits you would be looking to craft into your sculpture?
Gosh, I don't think there's been a better symbol of authoritarian education than the hammer from The Wall. The cartoon
Pink Floyd,
yeah, that goes along with "We don't need no education." The whole idea of a hammer sort of smashing down the poor innocent souls. God, that.
Sorry, Matt, I took that down a slightly more negative ending there than I intended. I thought I played to Edmund's creative strengths.
But yeah, it's the old adage: if you're only got a hammer, then you're liable to regard everything as a nail to be hit.
Point. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks,
Really appreciate you giving up your time, as well as thanks for sharing your insights. Keep flying the flag. Keep banging those doors, Edmund. It's really, really important stuff, and big respect to you and your colleagues.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.